Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, we're going to be talking about failure, as I am joined by author and serial failure, Andrew Thorp King. Andrew wrote the book, Failure Rules. He knows all about failure as he suffered things anywhere from divorce to bankruptcy to being fired to family estrangement, but he's came out the other side. He even calls himself a failure prepper. So we're going to be talking to him about failure and why failure is not necessarily a bad thing, even though you don't go out there just expecting to fail or trying to fail. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Curtis. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
Excited to jump into the topic.
Absolutely. Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yep. So my name is Andrew Thorp King. Background is primarily both in the music industry and in finance. I was an entrepreneur most of my life and a creative all of my life. So, I've done everything from, I own two record labels, one street punk, oi, psychobilly label, Sailor's Grave Records, one hardcore metal label, Thorpe Records, owned a fitness center, online lending companies, lead generation companies. I've done bodybuilding shows, written a spy novel. And now I work in financial technology and banking, in fintech banking in the payment space. And recently wrote this book, as Curtis mentioned, Failure Rules, the 5 Rules of Failure for Entrepreneurs, Creatives, and Authentics. And, like Curtis mentioned, while I've had many successes, I've also had many failures. And I think it's really the failures that have most buoyed me and shaped me for future success and given me the right posture, whether it's, a posture of gratitude, a posture of discernment, a posture of vision and of thinking in ways to reinvent and renew myself. And so I wrote this book on the value of failure and how we can premeditatively think about failure before it strikes, even though we do try to avoid it, like Curtis mentioned, and think of ways that we can shape the chaos of our failures to our advantage as we allow it to mold us into new beings on the other side.
So before we jump into the actual topic, just tell us how you got started in the music industry.
Yeah, sure. So ever since I was probably in middle school, I became enamored with punk rock music. It was, the angst, the energy, the creativity, the raw kind of vitality of punk rock music always struck me. It was something that really kind of aligned with I guess my own sense of my own unique identity in the world. And so there's always been like this soundtrack to my life. I mean, even this book, I have a soundtrack on Spotify and Apple Music of the songs that helped inspire me to write this book and inspire me to overcome some of the challenges I write about in the book. So music's always been there for me. It was probably in my early 20s when I was actually laid off from a job as a bill collector. And in that empty failure space, I could hear my internal spirit voice kind of guiding me to like take that risk and go after, pursuing the career in the music industry. And that's when I started my first record label, Thorpe Records. And, over 20 years later, between the two labels, I've released over 100 records and on the rights to, over 100 recordings and about half as many merch contracts. And, music's just always been there to buoy me.
Okay, well, you talk about yourself as a serial failure. What do you mean by that when you say serial failure?
Well, I think the reality is, right, when we're going after things that are difficult, when we're going after things that might invoke the highest use of our most unique talent stack, which is something we ought to go after, that when we're doing that, we're necessarily going to be traveling on more difficult paths that are going to be, more ripe with potential failures and difficulties and challenges and hard times, right? So as I've endeavored to do that, to kind of marry money and meaning and go after, these North Star aspirational dreams along my path, I've encountered a lot of failures. And so I would say, as much as I guess I'm a serial success in some ways, right? There's always degrees. I'm also a serial failure. And I think a lot of people want to ignore that. They want to whitewash the failure parts of their lives. And the reality is there's so much value in what we can learn from failures and what we can teach others about how to view them. And, I think it's really just uncovering that value and unearthing that prompted me to want to write this book and share it with the world. And it's not just about my stories. There's tons of other case studies in here, layered in to kind of bolster the lessons and the 5 rules of failures. I mean, everybody from legendary boxer Jack Johnson to author Stephanie Land, who wrote The Maid. There's a show on Netflix about her story, to Captain Tony Terracino, who used to be the mayor of Key West, Florida, to Stephen Pressfield, the author, to Gene Simmons from Kiss, to all kinds of people that I put in this book to give it kind of a wide selection of case studies to make really these lessons and rules come alive.
Well, you raised an interesting topic, perfection and failure. So explain perfection and failure and how they go hand in hand.
Yeah, I don't know if the perfection. It's more like, difficult difficult paths and failure, right? So when you're going after, something that is unorthodox, when you're trying to go after a non-traditional career path or life path with, a higher degree of danger, a less probability of success, but something that has the potential for higher meaning, I think that it's also then more ripe with, punctuations of failure. So, yeah, that would be my assertion.
Okay, you talk about the 5 rules of failure. So explain what your 5 rules of failure are that you talk
Sure.
about.
So, failure rule number 1 is failure purifies. It's the idea that the phoenix must burn to emerge. That when we encounter failures, when failures strike in our lives, that it's often, if we step back and we kind of remove our emotional involvement in the event, and we invoke more an objective third-party observational kind of position, that we can look at our failures and see that, oftentimes it could be really for our benefit. There might be old thinking that needs to die, old ways of being that need to die, and new ways of being that need to emerge, faulty foundations that needed to really kind of crumble. And so I think oftentimes it kind of burns off a lot of kind of accumulated waste in our lives, and is a real opportunity to reset and rebuild in a better way. And so that really takes, kind of oftentimes a more thoughtful, introspective approach to our failures, both before and during them. And I think that's really an important, important part of viewing failure. So that's failure rule number 1, is failure purifies. And one example I go through in the book is professional bowler Thomas Smallwood. So his story is, he's a blue collar working class guy in Michigan, was working at the Ford plant and got laid off. And he has a quote where he says, the worst thing that ever happened to me was getting laid off, but it led to the best results. And so his story is, as he was laid off, he was in this empty failure space, right? Similar to me with the story I just told about when I was laid off. And he, really dug deep and heard his internal spirit voice, and, was identifying what he needed to do to really kind of go after his highest, most unique skills. And for him, that was to become a professional bowler. And so while he's laid off, still looking for the practical mechanisms of a regular job to get back on his feet, he's, I think, engaged to his now wife at the time, wanted to start a family, all of that. He still went after that pursuit and ended up entering some bowling tournaments, scraping up $1,500. Long story short, in the period while he was still laid off, when the Ford plant went to go call him back and recall him to his job, he was able to say on the phone to him, "Sorry, I can't take that job. I'm now a professional bowler, but if you want to watch me on ESPN tomorrow, go ahead." So it literally came true within that failure space. He was able to actualize that latent dream that he might not have really ignited had he not fallen into that failure space to really be able to see it clearly. So that would be an example of kind of failure purifying us.
Okay, well, I know you touched on a couple of them, but tell the listeners about some of your failures and kind of how you, like you say, failure purified you and how you
Yeah.
handled it and bounced back.
So one in particular, I would say there was it's probably right around the time I began writing this book and was convicted to write this book. I was going through two twin failures. One was a business divorce, which really forced me to reorganize my work life and my income composite, as well as a marital divorce, which I, really was suffering from the emotional, shrapnel of that, and trying to reorganize my life. And so all of a sudden I found myself with no office to go to by day, no home to go to by night, living in a hotel room temporarily apart from my children. And I had a decision to make in that empty failure space. I could wallow in it, and I could slide into alcoholism, and I'm no stranger to alcohol. I love my bourbon, but instead, what I did is I invoked, what I call the divinity of purpose, which is a phrase I use often in the book. It's in the definition of terms within the book. And divinity of purpose is comes from a song by that same name by this metal band Hatebreed. The singer Jamie Joster wrote the song Divinity of Purpose, and that song really buoyed me during this time, and I really found ways to allow that failure to purify me and renew me, and it resulted in five very tangible efforts that really happened in that space. So one, I ended up consulting in the online lending business, and one of those consulting gigs ended up turning into a proper partnership for a lead generation company that became very lucrative. I ended up starting my career in corporate banking in the fintech space, and got a job in that space, which for me at the time was a big deal, going from online lending, which was less formal than corporate banking. I mean, it was almost like going from being, a porn star to a regular actor, to kind of migrate into that space. And that was a big deal. I've now been doing that for 10 years. Also finished my first spy novel and released that, reinvested my record labels and kind of resuscitated them with some great record releases, and then also began writing this book, Failure Rules. So there was like really five threads that were really born out of that failure space. So in that empty open space, I was able to really stretch myself, reinvent, and move forward on multiple fronts. And so that would be kind of one example of how failure really induced some creativity and forward movement for me in my life.
Well, I know you talk about them in your book, but tell us about some of the biggest influences or failure stories that you saw, maybe from other people, whether it was personally in your life or maybe a celebrity that said, "Yeah, I'm gonna draw strength and energy off of this person here."
Yeah, yeah. So, I think one of them would be one of the books that really inspired me to write this book was by James Altucher, the podcaster, investor, chess player, entrepreneur. He wrote a book called Choose Yourself, and just the rawness and the vulnerability of him talking about, his divorces and him losing millions and then trying to gain them back and then losing them again, and his zigzags and ups and downs was really inspiring. I mean, one of the things he always talks about is generating ideas and practicing generating ideas. He carries around a waiter pad and writes 10 new ideas down a day, even if he doesn't use them, just to practice that muscle of generating ideas. And so I think that's something that I really took to heart and always think about when I find myself converging into failure spaces, is always having a backlog, a redundant list of ideas. Unlike him, I keep a cigar box full of sticky notes of little ideas that come to my head. I haven't looked at it in years, but it's there if I need it, and I can go look at ideas, about how to move forward. And some of those ideas actually were ideas that ended up being ingredients in the book. So James Altucher would be one. Vince Flynn, the spy novelist, is somebody I always admired. He's since passed away in 2013, but I have a chapter in the book about him, and just the idea of time is not your friend. Get busy living instead of or you're busy dying. And his story is that he wanted to be a Marine, and ended up getting, was disqualified for the Marines because of a concussion he had when he was younger. So he had kind of a failure event there, but he was still trying to find this North Star aspirational pursuit that was worthy of his life. Ended up working, at a macaroni and at a craft for Kraft macaroni and cheese, selling mac and cheese. Ended up selling commercial real estate, but none of it was really scratching the itch. It was all kind of this faux life for him, and so he decided, well, I can't become a Marine, but I can, write about that life. And he had this story formulating in his head, which really revolved around this character, Mitch Rapp, which is the protagonist or anti-hero most in his stories. And and he decided to write. And so he wrote his first spy novel, and he took the big risk of quitting his day job and just bartending at night and writing all day. And eventually, after many failures, even with that, it took 4 to 5 years, but eventually he was able to build a career out of that. And so he's another one of those stories where, he was also dyslexic, so he wasn't even really prone to be a good writer, but he overcame that too. So, rejected from publishers. So he was disqualified from the Marines, rejected from publishers, and was struggling with dyslexia, and still overcame all of that, was able to peg himself to his North Star dream and align with his calling journey and kind of escape, which would, what would otherwise have been kind of a less eventful life where he wouldn't really have been maximizing his highest talents.
Well, you talk about in your bio how you must love yourself regardless of failure. So kind of expand on that and explain to the listeners what you mean when you say that.
Yeah, no, that's a key point too, really. It's just having that kind of non-attachment identity, right? Where your failure rule number 5 is you are not your failure. So it's the idea that you really need to detach from the optics of failure, decouple your identity from failure, see yourself as the eternal being, see yourself as something separate from what happens to you or what happens in your life, and know that you can always resketch your life, right? And really allowing the spiritual to lead the physical. I referenced the book by Kamal Ravikant in my book, his book, Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. Kamal had failed as a CEO, was very depressed, was living off his credit cards, could barely get out of bed, was falling into the abyss, ignoring messages from friends. And, at one point, Kamal looked in the mirror and decided that, I'm just going to decide to love myself. And he started kind of saying these mantras over and over again about loving himself, which sounds like some sort of, kind of like, woo-woo kind of practice. But the reality is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are very powerful, and we need to pay attention to them. And we should not, denigrate our own beings by telling stories that are disparaging about ourselves. We really need to see ourselves as, living sparks of divinity, no matter what our situation is. And I think having that kind of mindset will help us as we travel through failure spaces in this life.
So tell listeners kind of what they can expect when they read your book and where they can pick it up at.
Yeah, so it's Failure Rules, the 5 rules of failure for entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics. So, this is really, a blueprint to help you kind of shape your mindset around not just failures, but around the idea of marrying yourself with your calling journey, of finding ways to marry the practicality of the necessity of money in this world with the higher kind of strivings towards maximizing your unique talents in the world, often in unorthodox ways. And so that's what you'll discover in this book. You'll see, again, all kinds of awesome case studies, everything from J.K. Rowling to Henry Rollins to, like I said, Vince Flynn to billionaire Sarah Blakely, all kinds of people, and my own stories. The book is also, very much rooted in some punk rock flavoring, since that's my thing, and has some cigar culture kind of references too, since I'm steeped in cigar culture as well. I took 7 years to write it. The structure really revealed itself over time from draft to draft. And I think it really came out really well. And, I think the biggest compliment I've gotten from readers is they say it's accessible. It's not a short read. It's 480 pages, but there's lots of spacing, and it's structured in such a way where, you can even pick up a chapter standalone and get something out of it without having to read it sequentially. But great ratings on Amazon. Check it out there. You go to Andrew Thorp King with no E on the end of Thorpe, and you can get into my Instagram and follow me on Instagram at Andrew Thorp King, on YouTube at Andrew Thorp King. And I got some great merchandise too on the website. Soul and Fire Supply Company is a merch company that I started to echo the themes of the book. But yeah, go ahead and give it a read or give it a listen. The audiobook's awesome too. Pick up the audiobook if that's your thing.
Okay. Do you have any current or upcoming projects besides your book that you're working on? Other stuff that, listeners need to know about?
No, I think the book is really it for now. I'm gonna stay promoting this for several years and be doing a lot with it from an event standpoint, and I do some speaking and coaching around the topics of the book. So that's also one of the things that I'm involved with, and some great YouTube videos around the topic. So just gonna keep talking about these themes and keep trying to gain the trust of readers.
Okay, well, throw out that contact info one more time and also talk about any close us out with final thoughts. Maybe something I forgot to talk about that you would like to talk about it. Just any final thoughts that you have for the listeners along with that contact info again.
Sure. AndrewThorpKing.com is the website. No E on the end of Thorpe. You can find the book anywhere books are consumed online in all formats. Go check it out. You can also find me at YouTube at Andrew Thorp King and at Instagram at Andrew Thorp King. And there's a free Failure Rules mini course on my website that you can get. And then you'll also be signed up for the email list for ongoing content delivered to your inbox. Final thoughts, I would just say, home in again on failure rule number 5. You are not your failures. Learn to detach yourself from the optics of failures. Learn to decouple your identity from failures. See your failures as a teacher, not an undertaker, and find ways to shape the chaos of your failures to your own advantage so you can become the next version of yourself that's optimized.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, AndrewThorpKing.com. If you are someone that's looking to look at failure through a different lens, please be sure to pick up the book, follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. And if you have any guest suggestions or topic suggestions, see Jackson102 at cox.net is where you can send them to. Be sure to tell a friend about the show. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Curtis. Appreciate it.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.